trouble and sorrow no more. Trouble and sorrow, I'm going home to live with the Lord.
They say a bullet is colorblind, and on the battlefield of the Civil War, the quality of mercy was colorblind too. Clara Barton, who later founded American Red Cross, was there, aiding both black and white wounded soldiers. While most people are aware of the humanitarian achievements of Clara Barton, they don't know that people like Susie Taylor was also there. A former slave, she worked as an unpaid nurse on the same battlefields, performing the same tasks as Clara Barton, but unlike Clara Barton, she never received the recognition she deserved. This story is dedicated to the untold legacy, to Susie Taylor and the thousands of other unrecognized black Americans who, over more than a century of Red Cross service, have made invaluable contributions to America. In spite of prejudices against them that might have made others turn their back on those in need, a solid core of black Americans have been doing their part. This documentary has been made to set the record straight and honor those dedicated black Americans whose humanitarian actions have made them an integral part of the Red Cross from the beginning.
The year was 1858, and while Lincoln was making a name for himself, debating Stephen Douglas over the rights of states to exclude slavery, there was another Douglas creating even more controversy over human rights. Abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Lincoln called him the most meritorious man of the 19th century. Frederick Douglass was the first among many black Americans who were later to lend their hand to the Red Cross. Through the Civil War and in the years immediately following it, Clara Barton and Frederick Douglass were often seen rallying for human rights. In 1864, the International Red Cross was established in Switzerland, and Clara Barton decided that America needed a Red Cross of its own. For many years she lobbied, often discouraged, often depressed. She turned to those she trusted for advice.
Still depressed. Invited to lunch with Frederick Douglass at Susie Taylor's. I asked their opinion of my course. All decided I should go on.
It really wasn't even until 1882 that President Chester Arthur signed the Treaty of Geneva, making the United States a member of the international organization. And one of the original Central Committee members of the new American Association of Red Cross Societies was Frederick Douglass. So black participation in the destiny of the American Red Cross can be traced to its beginning.
In the intervening years, involvement in the American Red Cross by black Americans continued. In the aftermath of the Sea Island hurricane in 1893, 30,000 blacks, men, women, and children, barely a generation out of slavery, left homeless. Clara Barton rushed to start relief operations on her own. Moved by stories of the devastation, men from the 54th Massachusetts Colored Regiment, survivors of the same regiment Miss Barton had helped at Fort Wagner, traveled to volunteer their time to help Miss Clara with her own rescue battle. Many citizens chided Clara Barton's efforts, as noted in a letter she wrote to a friend.
Many people are calling my attention to my lack of knowledge of the Negro, that he never did, nor could he be made to work where any free rations or feeding were given. If provided for, he would at once become demoralized, lazy, worthless, and probably uncontrollable.
Despite all the advice, Clara Barton hired her first group of Black Red Cross disaster workers. They were hired on to cut and peel potatoes to feed victims. Sprouts from these potatoes were used to reestablish the vegetable gardens that would feed the flood victims long after the Red Cross left. The Sea Island tragedy provides one of the first examples of American blacks helping others through the Red Cross.
Well, it's flooding down in Texas, and all the telephone lines are down.
7 years later, black survivors of the Sea Island tragedy heard news about a tidal wave that had crashed over Galveston, Texas. Poor as they were, no one knew better how vital immediate help would be. They were among the very first to gather aid and send it to Clara Barton. Taking care of people in times of disaster was only one part of the Red Cross mandate. Through the years, other activities grew in importance. In 1915, Frances Elliott Reed Davis, a nurse at Freedman's Hospital, applied for Red Cross service. Although warned about the rejection she'd face, Davis persisted.
If we all gave up just because we've heard that others have been refused, Negroes will never make headway in the Red Cross.
Frances Elliott Reed Davis. In 1917, she became the first black nurse officially approved for assignment with the Town and Country Nursing Service, an early visiting nurse service provided by the Red Cross. When the U.S. declared war on Germany in 1918, blacks were eager to answer the call to service, both on and off the battlefield. However, recruiting stations generally refused to place black soldiers on the front lines. As if that weren't enough, the military even refused to allow black Red Cross nurses to participate overseas, even though they were being actively recruited by the Red Cross. The national chairman of Red Cross Nursing Services, Jane Delano, tried to explain.
We are enrolling colored nurses at the present time and shall continue to do so in order that they may be available if at any time there is an opportunity to assign them to duty in military hospitals.
The time and opportunity, however, never came, but not without protest. Emmett Scott, who was a special assistant to the Secretary of War and former confidential secretary to Booker T. Washington, even called a conference of 31 leading black newspapermen. They supported the war and called for the uses of Negro Red Cross nurses. But once again, the military refused.
We wanted very much to go over there. The Red Cross recruited us before we graduated, and we were hoping for overseas assignment. But the Army didn't call us up.
Eileen Stewart, former Red Cross nurse. After the war ended, the Secretary of War finally recognized those dedicated nurses. Ms. Eileen Stewart and 18 others became the first black women to serve veterans through the Army Nurse Corps. Also at war's end, black organizations and leaders gathered to help complete the financing of the costs of the war.
In the drive of the American Red Cross for a relief fund of $100 million in 1918, the colored citizens of the country contributed their proportionate share. Colored speakers eloquently pointed out the duty of the race to give liberally to the fund, and women and children daily took up collections in all kinds of public places with gratifying results.
Emmett Scott. Regardless of contributions made during the war, issues around segregation continued here at home. In 1917, Mary McLeod Bethune applied for membership in an all-white Southern chapter. Despite a glowing recommendation from the Northern Potomac chapter manager, she was rejected. This is the letter the Potomac manager received back.
I am in receipt of your letter of the 1st, and know carefully what you say about Mary McLeod Bethune. I have no doubt she has done great work with the colored people in Florida, that she is an intelligent woman and a good speaker. I beg to say that the chapter did exactly right in not allowing her to join it. You evidently know very little about the Negro situation in the South. If you did, you would not raise this question. This is the home of the Negro. We know their sentiments, and they know us. We treat them right, and they know their place. They are an inferior race, and we resent the suggestion from anyone that we should put them on a footing with us socially.
Mary McLeod Bethune was no ordinary volunteer searching for a place in the organization. A prominent civil rights activist, she later became part of Franklin Roosevelt's Black Cabinet, which began the fight for integration in the U.S. government. Later, she was asked to advise the American Red Cross at the first conference of Negro leaders held at national headquarters. Ironically, history proved that the Southern manager was absolutely right. Mary McLeod Bethune wasn't on the same level as they were. She was in a league by herself. The Roaring Twenties. While the history of the United States was being written in bathtub gin, the Black American history of the Red Cross was punctuated by huge disasters and small human dramas. Just as the Mary McLeod Bethunes are important to the Red Cross story, so are the Jonas Joneses of Geiger's Mill, South Carolina. When a tornado thundered through Geiger's Mill, it was Jonas Jones who turned his home into a first aid station. But emergency services has never been the sole reason for the Red Cross existence. The Booker T. Washington branch in Tampa, Florida, for example, graduated 124 women in home hygiene and care of the sick. These dedicated women financed their own classes so they could provide vital services in their community. (1927). Mississippi Delta blacks had plenty of reason to sing the blues. Massive floodwaters had victimized 75% of their race, leaving thousands without food or shelter. The Red Cross responded, setting up huge relief camps. Blacks were reportedly being discriminated against in regard to living conditions, work details, and the degree of relief provided. In response to these rumors of racial discrimination, Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of Commerce and Chairman of President Coolidge's Flood Committee, sent a telegram to Dr. Robert Moton, the principal of the Tuskegee Institute. He requested a colored advisory commission of Red Cross volunteers and external black leaders be established to investigate these rumors. In its report, the commission recommended that the Red Cross relieve white armed guardsmen from Negro refugee camps, except those who are stationed at the entrance to the camps. Borrow at once trained Negro social workers and health nurses to conduct clinics. and take the steps necessary to make sure the Red Cross clothing is evenly distributed among white and black refugees.
7 recommendations were made, and 7 orders of compliance were issued jointly by Secretary Hoover and Red Cross Vice Chairman James Pfizer. 7 recommendations, 7 orders of compliance, and yet nothing was done. Compliance would have been costly. It would have meant thousands of dollars spent, but more importantly, it would have involved taking a stance to aid disaster victims in the segregated South without regard to color. It was a stance the Red Cross wouldn't and didn't take seriously. So although the Red Cross showed progress in including leaders from the black community in the commission, they showed, unfortunately, they were still a product of their time.
She said the Red Cross people is feeding mighty fine. They're mixing everything up with whiskey and wine. I told her no. Baby, you know I don't want to go. Yes, and I ain't going down to no Red Cross door.
The Great Depression. All across the country, ordinary people, black and white alike, found out the hard way what disaster really meant. Both the economy and nature were out of control. During the 1930-31 Mississippi drought, people like Agnes Wood, who had proudly contributed her share to her local black Red Cross chapter in the past, suddenly found herself on the receiving end of the line. Segregation remained a troublesome fact of life throughout the South, and even the Red Cross bowed to the weight of common practice and maintained separate operations for matters as basic as food and flour lines. Segregation was part of the American fabric and would require another 25 years to overcome. As the nation approached World War II, the military, as well as national institutions, remained segregated. But by war's end, there were some integrated military units, and the Red Cross began to change its stance as well. This change was personified in the appointment of Dr. Charles Drew, director and medical supervisor of the first American Red Cross blood bank. He discovered the necessary techniques to mass-produce blood plasma for shipment overseas. His contribution directly saved thousands of soldiers and civilian lives, and led to the formation of the American Red Cross Civilian Blood Donor Service, which later became today's American Red Cross Blood Services. Unfortunately, Dr. Drew's contributions ended prematurely in tragedy on April 1st, 1950. Dr. Drew and 3 medical colleagues were driving from Washington to Tuskegee, Alabama for clinical meetings. There was a crash, and Dr. Drew, the driver, died.
The rumors that spread after the tragic accident of Dr. Drew was that he was denied blood simply because he was black. However, those were just rumors. According to Dr. Bullock, who happened to have been in the car at the time of the accident with Dr. Drew, admitted that the hospital did everything within their control to ensure that he got the blood that he needed. Unfortunately, the injuries were too severe. Blood donations were segregated during World War II. The military encouraged the segregation of blood donations simply because there were whites that felt as if they would not survive if in fact they were transfused with black blood. However, as casualties increased and as more blacks were placed in danger zones, then the military finally agreed and relented that there was a greater need for blood donations and that they would accept donations from blacks. The American Red Cross, in ensuring that there was a sufficient blood supply, did in fact accept donations, however it was processed separately.
As World War II intensified, it became apparent that we were all in it together, and the Red Cross willingly recognized the need to reach to all groups for participation and financing. In 1942, the first conference of Negro leaders was held at national headquarters. Prominent and well-respected black leaders gathered. Frank discussions dominated the sessions, and while they had high praise in general for the work of the Red Cross, they also pushed the organization to make it take a leadership position in ending segregated blood policies and facilities for servicemen overseas and here at home. They demanded the Red Cross take a stand for fair hiring, recruitment, and participation of blacks at both the local chapter level and at national headquarters. At nearly the same time, Donald Wyatt, a field service overseas director, appealed to the national headquarters to recruit more black field service officers, because the barrier of segregation was also a barrier to communication.
In some instances, there were circumstances in which the black soldier would be somewhat embarrassed by revealing the nature of his problem to a white person. I found that they felt that a black field director would be more understanding and more sympathetic, and therefore they were freer in outlining the full details of his problem to the black field director.
The pressures of war rubbed reality into everyone's face. There were certainly qualified black Americans available to do the jobs America needed doing. In 1943, Jesse Thomas came over from the Treasury Department to take the first professional position on the national headquarters staff. At the time, Red Cross Vice Chairman James Pfizer hired him to be the special assistant to the Director of Domestic Operations.
In fully 95% of the chapters, no blacks even had professional status.
Jesse Thomas. Once Thomas got his foot in the door, and with Pfizer's full support, the racial barriers that had existed for 60 years finally began to crumble. Blacks represented a growing part of the professional staff, and more they became involved in operations. They taught and participated in home nursing, recreation for veterans, first aid and accident prevention, and water safety courses. At the end of 1950, racial designations were removed from all Red Cross blood.
The 50s represented a time of change for both the Red Cross and the United States. And while the doors to the schoolhouse may have needed the full weight of the law to force them open, the doors to the Red Cross were opened from the inside. Minority initiatives became a major thrust, and black participation at every level was welcomed. We no longer had just a handful of elite blacks who were a credit to their race. There were opportunities for everyone. The Red Cross became a place where society could change and be changed, where blacks could be leaders and old stereotypes and myths could be destroyed. And by 1964, America was ready for change.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is signed at the White House by President Johnson. Before an audience of legislators and civil rights leaders who have labored long and hard for passage of the bill, President Johnson calls for all Americans to back what he calls a turning point in history.
Over the years, segregated facilities have been replaced by community-based chapters where everyone could participate, regardless of race. The decade saw increasing numbers of Black American volunteers and paid staff appointed in governance and management positions. In the 1980s, Dr. Jerome Holland was appointed chairman of the Red Cross, and Gwen Jackson became national chairman of volunteers. Susie Taylor, Frederick Douglass, Jonas Jones, Mary McLeod Bethune, Dr. Charles Drew, Eileen Stewart, and others. The history of the Red Cross is a history of Black participation and accomplishment too. Blacks have had a strong influence in and on the Red Cross from its very beginning. That is the untold legacy. But even more important is the opportunity Black Americans have to make their mark on the Red Cross of tomorrow, because the legacy that they will leave promises to be the most exciting one of all.